Imagine a valley buried in white, temperature dropping below -20 degrees, wind cutting like a blade, snow arriving weeks earlier than expected, and you in the middle of all of it, with no electric heating, no modern insulation, no supplies to last more than 3 days, no gas, no generators, no cell signal, no neighbors for miles. That would kill someone unprepared, right? But the people who lived in the Appalachian Mountains for centuries did exactly this. Not for a week, not for a season, for generations. They raised children, stored harvests, survived winters that buried animals alive in the snow. Inside shelters they built with their own hands, using nothing you wouldn't find in a forest. It wasn't luck, it wasn't mysticism.
This is the
it
way
wasn't
of our
superior
ancestors.
physical strength.
Hold
It was
this
engineering.
knowledge close.
It
and
was
remember
knowledge
those
passed
who
from
came
father to
before you.
son, from grandmother to granddaughter, refined across decades of trial and error, and fatal error. Every detail of those structures existed for a reason. Every angle, every layer, every choice of material had survived the harshest test there is, a real winter. And here is the question that will drive everything that follows. What actually kept these people alive? Choosing the right location, the design of the shelter, or the daily routines they practiced without fail? What's your guess? Drop it in the comments right now. We'll be testing it throughout the video. Survival doesn't begin when the snow falls. It begins months before the first flake, before the first cold wind comes down the slope, before any threat becomes visible. Preparation was the system itself, and skipping that phase meant dying in autumn, before winter had even truly begun. The first decision was the most critical of all. Where to build. Not aesthetics, not convenience, not the most beautiful spot in the landscape. It was life or death mathematics. The north-facing slope was completely off the table. Exposed to the prevailing wind, no afternoon sun to warm the walls, damp, freezing, shadowed for months at a time. Anyone who built there paid for it with extra firewood every single night, with walls that never fully dried, with moisture that would rot any wooden structure within a few years. The risk was direct. More wind exposure meant more heat loss per hour. And heat loss in an Appalachian winter was measured in days, not weeks. The right choice was the south-facing slope, gently inclined with dense vegetation to the north acting as a natural windbreak. The temperature difference between an open valley and a well-positioned slope could reach 10 degrees. 10 degrees might sound small on paper. On a stormy night with 40-kilometer-per-hour winds, those 10 degrees separated tolerable discomfort from dying of hypothermia in your sleep. But the right slope wasn't enough. Elevation mattered. Building flush with the ground was an open invitation for moisture. Moisture that crept through the floor, that froze in the cracks, that silently and efficiently destroyed any wooden structure over time. A few handspans of elevation made the difference between a dry floor in February and a floor that turned to sponge by the second winter. The decision. Raise the floorboards on small stone pillars. Create an air gap underneath. Break the direct contact between wood and cold, wet earth. Risk avoided. Direct consequence. Heat retained for hours longer every cold night. And there was a third factor most people never consider, the water that comes from below. Not the snow from above, that's visible and predictable. The groundwater, water tables, rainfall that migrates through soil, snowmelt that percolates through the earth for weeks before surfacing. Anyone who built without mapping the natural drainage of the land woke up with a flooded floor during the first heavy winter rain. The solution wasn't chemical waterproofing, they didn't have that. It was observation, weeks of observation before choosing the exact spot, tracking exactly where water flowed after a rainstorm, building perpendicular to that flow, never in its path, never in a depression where water pooled. A fourth criterion came before a single log was cut, the prevailing wind. Where did it come from during most storms? Which way did the surrounding vegetation bend? In which corner did fallen leaves accumulate? Answering those questions precisely determined the orientation of the entrance, never facing into the wind, always sheltered, always at an angle. Every one of these decisions came before a single tree was felled. Survival begins in thought, not in action. And thought begins long before the emergency. What looked like a rustic cabin was thermodynamics disguised as simplicity. Every element had a dual function. Every choice solved two problems at once, not by accident, by absolute necessity. When you can't afford to waste energy, when every log carried represents sweat and risk of cold exposure, every construction decision needs to deliver twice what it costs. The first element was the most obvious and the most underestimated, embedding part of the structure into the hillside. Not to save material, pure physics. Soil at 1 meter of depth maintains a stable temperature even in the most brutal winter. While external air drops to -20 degrees, the earth at that depth stays between 4 and 6 degrees, above zero year-round. The buried wall acted as passive insulation, absorbing internal heat during the day when the fire burned, then slowly releasing it at night when the fire died down. Exactly the same principle modern engineers apply in low-energy construction. What we now call passive thermal design or bioclimatic architecture existed in these Appalachian hills for more than 2 centuries, with no technical name, no patent, just results. The second element was wall thickness, not just structural resistance against wind. Thermal mass, the principle that heavy, dense materials take far longer to exchange heat with their surroundings. Thick walls, built from stacked logs with compacted clay and moss filling every gap, took hours to shed the heat accumulated during the day. A thin wall loses heat in 30-40 minutes on a stormy night. A thick wall holds the warmth while the family sleeps, while the fire is low, while the outside cold reaches its peak just before dawn. Think of the principle behind a thermos flask, but at the scale of a human dwelling. The roof came next, and it was where the greatest concentration of knowledge lived. The 2-layer covering, wood below, compacted earth on top, functioned exactly like a modern double-glazed window. The air layer, trapped between the two materials, created a physical barrier against heat exchange between the warm interior and the frozen exterior. The earth above added weight, thermal mass, and waterproofing. And then came the counterintuitive detail, the thing that separated the experienced from the reckless. Snow accumulated on the roof was not a problem. It was additional insulation. A 30-centimeter layer of snow significantly reduces heat loss through the roof. Anyone who climbed up to clear it out of excessive caution was unknowingly dismantling their own insulation system and burning precious energy to make their situation worse. The fourth element was the entrance, and here the engineering became genuinely elegant. Never a direct door facing the outside, always a short corridor, set at an oblique angle to the prevailing wind. This corridor functioned as a pressure chamber. When the inner door opened, wind didn't travel in a straight line into the warm heart of the shelter. Cold air slowed inside the corridor and lost momentum. Some interior heat escaped, but not the mass of warm air that had taken hours to accumulate. The difference between having and not having that corridor could cost hours of heating per day, multiplied by every entrance and exit. In deep winter, when you went out repeatedly for firewood, water, and traps, the corridor paid for itself hundreds of times over. The fifth element was the position of the fire, not at the center of the structure, as instinct suggests, slightly offset toward the side opposite the entrance, and raised a few hands above the floor. That combination created what we now call a natural chimney effect. Cold air entered low through the base of the door, and the corridor, heated rapidly as it passed over the elevated fire, rose toward the roof and exited through a ventilation opening strategically placed in the opposite wall. Heat circulated through the entire space before escaping. Stale air and carbon dioxide left continuously without the occupant needing to intervene. The shelter breathed in a controlled way, without losing temperature in any critical way. And the sixth element was what no one saw, what lay beneath everything, the floor. Compressed dry leaves in a thick layer, covered by cured hide or flat planks of wood. That organic layer completely insulated the body from contact with the cold ground beneath. Lying directly on a wooden floor, even inside a heated shelter, drained body heat at a startling rate. The cold of the earth below was constant, silent, unrelenting. An insulated floor multiplied the efficiency of the entire heating system, because it kept warmth where the human body needed it, instead of losing it to the ground below. None of these elements worked in isolation. That becomes clear when you study each part separately. But here comes the problem no one anticipates when they study each piece on its own. Building right was half the work. The other half was operating the system every day, every night without fail.
The wind grows stronger.
Because in an extreme winter, one protocol error could be the last. There was no second chance to discover who got the night shift wrong. Nights were divided into watches, not out of paranoia, out of physical necessity documented across generations of lived experience. The fire needed feeding at regular intervals, generally every 3 to 4 hours. Letting the embers die out completely wasn't just uncomfortable, it was catastrophic in terms of energy efficiency. Recovering the warmth of a space that had genuinely gone cold, that had lost the thermal mass accumulated in its walls and floor, consumed far more firewood than simply keeping the temperature stable through the night. It was more efficient to wake once in the night to add 2 or 3 logs than to wake at dawn in a space that had descended to critical temperatures during the coldest hours, typically between 3 and 5 in the morning. Mornings began with inspection, not with coffee, not with food, with systematic inspection. New cracks in the clay between logs, moisture accumulation on interior walls, any sign of seepage in the floor, any change in how the fire behaved that might signal a problem with ventilation. Small problems left unattended became large problems within 48 hours. A gap the size of a thumb on a north-facing wall on a windy night could compromise the entire heating system. And here is the detail almost no one notices. Ventilation could not be eliminated. It had to be precisely controlled. This was exactly where inexperienced people made fatal errors. The instinct of someone who is cold is to close everything, seal every crack, fill every gap, prevent any cold air from outside from touching the warm interior. But a completely sealed shelter with an active fire accumulates carbon dioxide progressively and silently. The occupant falls into a deeper sleep than normal, because CO2 acts as a sedative at elevated concentrations. Heart rate drops, breathing becomes shallow, and the person simply doesn't wake up. Silent death. No pain, no warning at all. The solution was maintaining minimal but constant ventilation, a specific opening, positioned strategically to avoid dissipating excess heat while ensuring continuous air renewal. That precise balance was the line between sleeping safely and never waking up. But here is the dilemma that made it even harder to calibrate over time. Overheating the space solved one immediate problem and created a more insidious one. Excessive heat caused perspiration during sleep or during any physical work done inside the shelter. Sweat-soaked clothing, especially the layers closest to the body. Wet clothing, in a space that would eventually cool when you went outside for firewood or to check traps, became a lethal trap with devastating efficiency. Moisture in fabric conducted cold directly to the skin at a rate far greater than dry fabric would. In some scenarios, you were worse off in wet clothing than you would have been with no protection at all. The practical rule passed down was to keep the shelter warm enough not to shiver, never warm enough to sweat. That difference of a few degrees was measured by the body itself, by accumulated experience, by close attention to physical reactions over days and weeks. And it was passed from generation to generation, not as abstract theory, but as deep physical habit, as common sense that only makes sense once you've nearly made the mistake. Cold was not the only enemy. A prolonged winter brought other pressures, layers of threat that built as the months advanced. Predatory animals, starving in the general scarcity of deep winter, came close to human shelters drawn by warmth and the smell of stored food. Scarce supplies created tension between groups that normally cooperated without difficulty. Respiratory illness spread more easily in enclosed spaces, with reduced air circulation and people remaining in close proximity for long stretches. The response was always the same, overlapping layers of defense. The first layer was the design of the structure itself. The entrance corridor forced any intruder to slow down, bend their body, and make unavoidable noise on the way in. There was no way to enter at speed or in complete silence through that angled passageway. This held true for animals drawn in by the smell of stored meat, as much as for human beings with hostile intent during times of extreme scarcity. The architecture created a natural advantage for whoever was inside, without any additional technology. The second layer was strategic proximity to other shelters. Total isolation was a luxury the winter did not allow, and one that communities surviving across generations had learned to reject. 2 or 3 shelters built within a few minutes' walk of each other multiplied the collective capacity to respond to any emergency. A community member with a high fever could receive care and attention without their entire group abandoning the warmth and safety of the main shelter. Supplies could be redistributed when one group ran short on firewood through some unforeseen event. And the simple fact of not being completely alone reduced the psychological weight of a winter that could last 5-6 months in a row. Have you ever wondered how it was possible to maintain clear thinking and sound judgment after months inside a small space, in constant cold with reduced food? The answer lay precisely in that web of social proximity. Regular human contact was an essential part of the survival system, just as essential as thick walls and a controlled fire. The third layer was the strategic stockpiling of firewood and supplies. Never inside the main shelter, the risk of accidental fire, of a spark reaching the pile during the night, was too high to ignore. Firewood was kept in a secondary shelter, covered, dry, separated from the main structure but accessible in under a minute's walk with adequate protection. The route to fetch firewood was mentally timed. No one went out unprotected, and no one went out alone during a nighttime storm, regardless of how urgent it seemed. Protocol practice during the still comfortable autumn, repeated until it became automatic, burned into muscle memory before it was ever truly needed. Because when the emergency comes, there is no time to think. There is only time to execute what the body already knows how to do with its eyes closed, without hesitation, without internal debate. So, let's return to the question. What actually kept these people alive? Choosing the right location, the design of the shelter, or the daily routines? The answer is that the question was a trap from the very beginning, because none of the 3 worked without the other 2. Choosing the right location with the wrong design still killed. The best design in the wrong location still killed. And getting the first 2 right with a broken protocol still killed. The complete system was exactly that, a system. Every layer depended on the one before it and supported the one after. That is what the tradition carried. Not a single isolated technique. An integrated set of interdependent decisions, where every element played a function within a larger whole. Think about what that means today. It's not just about surviving in the wilderness. It's about how systems work. A business with a sound strategy but a broken operational protocol fails. A well-designed diet executed without routine doesn't last. A relationship with solid foundations but no daily maintenance deteriorates. The ancestral knowledge that looked primitive was, in fact, too sophisticated to be captured in a manual. It had to be lived, practiced, tested, passed body to body before it was ever passed word to word. And it survived for centuries because it worked, not because it was mystical, because it was engineering. There are more techniques like this, forgotten, buried in oral memory, recorded only by those who paid close attention. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.